Good afternoon, everybody. There were a lot of rural disasters in Canada over the past couple of years, and that's really what encouraged me to seek out today's speaker. Ron Bowles is with us from the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and he's going to talk about the Rural Disaster Resilience Project. Ron has 30 years of experience as a practitioner, educator, and researcher in pre-hospital care and emergency services. He comes from the Justice Institute of BC as an instructor in 1992. His graduate work has focused on educational technology, and his doctoral work explored the development of expertise in high-fidelity simulations. He joined the Rural Disaster Resilience Project in 2011 and led the development of online tools and websites. So thank you very much for joining us, Ron.
Good afternoon, and thanks very much. If you're wondering what a paramedic who does curriculum theory is doing in a Rural Disaster Resilience Project, so am I. As mentioned, I came to the JI about a little over 20 years ago as a paramedic, got involved in instructional design and curriculum development, did a lot of work with educational technology, and I just recently finished my PhD in curriculum theory. I moved over to our applied research division a few years ago and inherited the RDRP project. The original PI was in the midst of retiring, and this was one of her babies. And my expertise and what I brought into the project was on the educational technology side, and the piece of it that I was most intimately involved with was a conversion from paper-based materials into an online. So that's how I kind of got to the project. The project itself is really unique and really interesting. It involves coming up with systems and supports for folks in rural communities who are looking to do emergency management and disaster planning. Where we're headed over the next 30-40 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about what the JI is and what the RDRP project is. What came out of the project, which was a planning framework and a set of tools. We're in the process now. The project is finished, it's up, it's operational, and we're trying to get the word out and talk a little bit about next steps. The Justice Institute is a public post-secondary vocational institute. We deal with public safety. We are involved with preparing the folks that help keep communities safe. We're probably most known for our police academy, fire academy, School of Health Science with the paramedics, where I came from. But we've also got a really strong emergency management division where this project comes out of, as well as a lot of social justice. We do a lot of work with social workers, conflict res, that kind of thing. The Rural Disaster Resilience Project itself came out of a collaboration between the JI and a number of partners. It was funded by the Center for Security Science, who oddly enough, the Department of National Defense are the folks through their D&D research wing that provide a lot of the funding for emergency management research in the country these days. And this was a 3-year project funded by the Center for Security Science. The JI was the, pardon me, I'm losing my voice. Either I've hit puberty or my seasonal wheeze is back. The JI was the lead on it. We were the PIs, and we also worked with the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're the 3 funding partners. We did a lot of work with Natural Resources Canada. I'll mention them again when we get to the online conversion. And we partnered with Royal Roads and Pierce's 2 Consulting. 3 people were really involved in putting the project together. Our former dean, Carolyn Maritunga, who recently retired, Robin Cox from Royal Roads, and Dr. Laurie Pierce, who's our research chair on the emergency management side. Again, we always like to thank the Center for Security Science for funding the project. They've been great partners for us, and they continue to support us as we move this project forward. There were a couple things that made this project unique, and I'm relatively new to the disaster planning and emergency management world, but I've learned a phenomenal amount in the last couple of years, and it's been really intriguing. And particularly as somebody who worked in the emergency services for 15 or 20 years, and I started in the Okanagan working in a lot of rural and remote communities there. And several of the ideas that sit underneath this project are near and dear to my heart as a practitioner. One was the idea of fostering resilience and conceiving resilience in a way that was very community bound and very community centric. And I'll read it. The outcome of a process that transformed knowledge about the risk environment into actionable strategies that reduce vulnerability and increase the capacity to adapt to uncertain hazard threats over time. The fellow that wrote that is a dear friend, Murray Journay, and he's an academic, as you can tell by the way that this is phrased. But the idea behind resilience is that it's not just about bouncing back. It's not strictly about surviving a disaster or surviving some kind of emergency and having the ability to rebuild and grow from that. Resilience in the conception of this project is a much broader construct that has as much to do with looking forward and developing the ability to withstand the good things that happen on a day-to-day basis in a community, as well as the unforeseen things that come along. And from this perspective, resilience is very much embedded in the people and in the fabric of the community and in the relationships between the people and the environment that they're in. The project very deliberately targeted remote, rural, and coastal communities. There's a thriving emergency management system in Canada. There's a lot of work done on it. I've met some just phenomenal people over the last couple of years that are involved in this. Unfortunately, most of the work that's done is pushed forward by professional planners that are in dedicated roles, most of them within municipalities, regional districts, and government. About 20% of Canada's population still lives in the 80% of the landmass that you'd consider remote and rural. And remote, rural, and coastal communities face a number of challenges in trying to adapt and get ready for disasters. They face a number of unique challenges, not the least of which are physical barriers and isolation. Many of these communities have one way in, one way out, so all it takes is one landslide to lock off a community. And if the landslide was associated with weather hazards, you can't even resupply by air. In British Columbia in particular, a lot of our remote and rural communities are literally physically blocked off from other access to the broader infrastructure of the province. And these communities can be isolated. Communities that are as little as 15 kilometers away from suburban centers can find themselves isolated and withdrawn in times of emergency. By definition, rural and remote communities have fewer resources and less training to deal with disasters and emergency preparedness. They have less infrastructure, although oddly, some of the most critical infrastructure in the country runs alongside and through some of our remotest communities. And the fact that we could have an earthquake or a landslide or flooding in some of these remote communities can have a really devastating impact on our power transmission, our telecommunications, those kinds of things. The other challenge that these communities face is that they have to deal with multiple levels of jurisdiction. Many rural communities are not incorporated. Many don't have formal governance structures. Some have informal and even formal municipal structures, but most of the government resources that they need are housed at the regional or the provincial level. Throw in the fact that most of the rural communities in Canada are either primarily Aboriginal communities or have significant Aboriginal communities embedded in them. You've now got to deal with the federal infrastructure that comes along with that. So trying to affect any kind of change, trying to get any kind of support for a lot of these communities is really difficult. They've got barriers that the urban communities don't face. They have no clear lines of authority and no clear avenues for obtaining funding. And when they want to affect change, everyone that they go to ask tells them that they need to talk to someone else. The other idea that was sitting underneath this project that I'm really fond of is that it's very much based on an organic, community-based, bottom-up approach to the world. Most disaster planning, most emergency planning is very top-down. We've got national programs that mandate what kind of resources you have to have, what kind of processes should be in place, and There were targeted programs to get these things out there, and you have to fit within that. Very few of these programs actually serve well the remote and rural communities. Again, almost by definition, remote and rural communities are very unique in the challenges that they face, even from each other. So what we wanted to really look for was a way to explore what resilience means and what emergency management and disaster planning means to remote and rural communities, and to come up with processes that would support them instead of trying to constrain them and force them to do things a specific way. Again, an intriguing part of this project was the realization that resilience really is a defining characteristic of remote and rural communities. One of the things that the researchers found when they went into the communities was that a lot of the communities were very self-sustaining. They were very self-reliant. The idea of having 72 hours of supplies on hand to deal with an emergency was laughable in a place that sometimes goes 3 and 4 months without access to the outside world. So a lot of the ideas that we bring down from above just don't make sense in their setting. Resilience is how they live. Resilience is how the remote parts of our country actually operate on a day-to-day basis. And again, with the mindset of the folks that went in there, it was very much not about what can we teach you about resilience. It was very much a perspective of what can we learn from you and what can we bring out and what can we share with other people and take up the ladder for the top-down folks. The project itself spanned literally from coast to coast and spanned a time period of about 3 different years. As a research project, it started off with quite a substantial literature review that was taking a look at all the different models and methods that are out there. One of the things that we found, and we continue to find as we stay in this process, is that there's a tremendous number of tools and resources out there for communities to use. And that's one of the challenges that we're still facing with this project is we're worried that we're just going to become one more of the pieces that somebody doing another project 2 years from now will find in the literature review. From the literature review, some conceptual models were put together, some basic ideas coming out of the researchers on the approaches that they were bringing in their own expertise with what they were finding in the literature. And then that was taken out and they interviewed folks from around 16 communities across the country. The primary focus of the interviews in the focus group was in British Columbia. That was a convenience strategy. It was the people that they had access to. It was the networks that they were involved in. But it was a good place to start, and they broadened that out by some targeted interviews with other folks across the country, and then went and looked for some specific case studies of communities that had had successful emergency planning processes. Coming out of that was what we called the draft framework. And the draft framework was an overall approach to disaster planning from a rural community perspective and a set of tools and resources that the communities could use. The idea was to give communities not only a process that they could follow, but also to give them access to, again, the plethora of resources that were out there. And we drafted a number of communities to do some field testing, the community-based field sites. And these were the 5 communities across the country that agreed to take the draft process and try it out in their community and see how well that it worked for them. They were brave folks, because what we did was walk in with a binder that, with no word of a lie, the first draft of it was 4 inches thick. And we told them that we had a nice, simple, user-friendly system for them to engage with. They had a little bit of feedback for us on that. One of the real challenges with this project, and really with any kind of project, is how do you develop something that is comprehensive and robust and can be used in multiple locations and multiple contexts, but is still simple enough and easy enough to engage with and not so overwhelming that people that are volunteering and doing this off the side of, they're not even doing it off the side of their desk, they're doing it off the side of their kitchen tables. How do you come up with something that's robust, comprehensive, and yet is still something that people are willing to engage with? And dropping off a 4-inch binder is not one of the ways to do that. although I'll be fair to the people who put the 4-inch binder together, it is a very layered document and a very layered process. There is a simple model on top of it. There's a really nice structure to the work that's in it, and that most of the 4 inches were the resources that supported things. So we talk about, they'd identified 84 different hazard types, and there was a document that talked about each of the hazard types, what it meant, cases of where this hazard had actually caused problems in Canadian communities, and then resources on how to recognize it, how to plan for it, how to deal with it. So a lot of what we were dropping off were the resources that you would use on if this was one of the areas that you wanted to spend some time with. But as I mentioned, one of the primary pieces of feedback we got was that it was a comprehensive system that people continued to get lost in. The communities ranged, I think the largest was 5,000, the smallest was around 300. So these were very definitely small communities. We were very quickly disabused of the notion that rural communities are not technologically savvy. The smallest community had a couple of retired teachers and a couple of people that were very technologically plugged in and were great. We had folks from some of the larger communities that talk about those damn computers. So one of the things that we really learned, and we should know it because many of us on the team actually come from rural communities in our own past, you can't make assumptions about who's in the community and what their backgrounds and their experience and their capabilities are. So that was, for us, it was something that we kind of knew. It was kind of the idea that we walked into the project with, but it kept coming back and hitting us on the head that every community was unique and you shouldn't make too many assumptions. These folks worked through the process. We give them tremendous credit. They spent anywhere from a couple of months to almost a year working on the project. The model was to develop a project that a community could run on its own. The researchers were there to stare over their shoulder, to give them advice when it was needed, but primarily to watch how they engaged with the process, how they engaged with the resources and tools, and how we could improve that. We got that back, and boy, did we get some feedback. One of the other things that I'll say is that the folks that worked their way through it just gave us some really nice stuff. That was about the time that I came into the project when the pilot material had come back. The tools and resources were reformulated and restructured, put back together into an overall framework. And then from there we took and converted it to an online system, which made use of the strengths of the way the process worked and the way it was structured, made things a lot easier for communities to work with. Last year we ran, with some additional funding, we were able to run an implementation study with some folks out of Kent Agassiz and a few other communities that also joined in. So we took the proof of concept pieces and we've actually operationalized and got them out there. As a research project, there are that ran over 3 or 4 years. A lot of publications and presentations that came out of it. Everything from local emergency planning conferences through to the national roundtable on disaster resilience, CRHNet, and it was also presented at the World Congress on Disaster and Emergency Medicine a few times. Project reports that are available on the JI's website, a number of publications in the peer-reviewed world, and there are articles and newsletters that are available from the project's website. And then one of the more fun projects that I've had in the last 10 years was putting together the final research report that summarized all this stuff. This massive stuff was very much like the Old Testament. It was written by about 15 or 18 different people who were involved in the project, and sometimes you wondered if they bothered to read what the other ones had said. That's not true. They actually built on each other very nicely. But trying to synthesize it and summarize it was a fun part. The process itself is where I'm headed next, and I'll maybe just take a pause there and ask if anyone has any questions before I tell you about the framework and the tools. Well, that allowed me to get my water, so thank you. I'm a real fan of this of the piece that the researchers put together here. It's a really nicely layered approach to how to take something on in your community and to engage with it to the degree that makes sense to your community and that you're interested in. It's a really simple process. 4 steps. Get started, do an assessment, build a resilience plan, and put it into action. And like all simple processes, the devil's in the details. There are 16 activities that the communities can choose to engage with. So each step has a series of 3 or 4 or 5 activities that prepare you. So on the getting started side, if you're a community that has no formal structure, there's an activity there that tells you how to form a community input group, how to form a steering committee, how to hold a town hall meeting if you've never held a town hall meeting in your community before. If you've got a fairly sophisticated community, there's an activity there on gathering information about your community that involves things like a photo walk, where you walk through your community and you take photos of the critical infrastructure. You take photos of the buildings and the commercial structures that support your community. So it ranges from very simple resources and very simple activities for folks that don't have very much experience, through to some stuff that can get quite engaged. If you want to, there's an activity in there about doing mapping and visual analytics and looking at how you can build maps and overlay different types of information onto it. So if you want to do a really sophisticated analysis of your community, the resources are there to do it. It's really cool. And then underneath the 16 activities are links to what used to be 4 inches of resources. Now, the intent is not that you engage with this and do all 16 activities and read every one of those resources. If you did that, you'd still be at it. And as somebody who tried to edit this thing a few times, I can tell you that there's a lot there to read. But the intent of the process is you do the 4 steps, you take a look at the activities, and your community engages in the activities that make most sense for it and that you have the resources to engage with. And then the resources that are there, you only go to the ones that make sense for you. There were 3 technology-supported deliverables. The first is the Disaster Risk Resilience Planning Network. It's a virtual community of practice. It's just for techie folks. It's just a really simple Drupal website, but it's got some really neat features to it. It allows people to come together and first to access some of those resources that we found on our literature review. So there's links out in a database that we're slowly dumping stuff into. So if you want to, again, we found a lot of resources, but there were 2 things missing in the resources we found. One was that there was nobody telling you what you would use this thing for and whether or not it was any good. And then they were all over the place. So we're looking at the VCOP, the Virtual Community of Practice, as a place where you can have a searchable database of resources around emergency planning, and that they'll over time get annotated so that people will be able to find what they need where they need it. It's a site where communities can get together and share stories. The first communities that have gone in have put up a few things for us, and we really see this over time becoming a place where a small community or somebody in a small community who's wanting to get a project going can go in and find some case studies. Here's what our community did, here's how we engaged with it, here's what we found helped, and here's what got in the way for us. So it's a communication site. And then the third thing that it is a portal that provides a password-protected workspace for your community. So your community can come in, have a secure site that allows a document repository. It's got communication tools. You've got wikis and blogs so that you can journal and share stories, do collaborative writing, all of that kind of stuff. The second thing that was there that we built in this project was the RDRP planning framework itself. So we've got a web-based version of the binder that walks people through the process and gives you access to the resources. And then specifically, there are 3 tools built into it: a hazard risk analysis, a hazard resilience index, and a rural resilience index. And let's see if it tabbed it, that's why. So just the Disaster Resilience Network, drrplan.net. When you enter it, you can register and request a new password. and create an account. The spammers of the world have found the site, and we routinely get a couple hundred people trying to log into the site a day, all with them with usernames like JRKZ$56. But we actually do have a fair number of communities and groups that have created sites on. The group area has blogs, document repository, events, notices, polls, wikis, so all the tools that you would want to engage in a community process. The resources is the database tool. You'll be able to go into here and identify the hazards that you want to find resources on. Take a look at themes around, say, climate change and what types of resources you're looking for, and away you go. And yeah, it's probably not hooked in right now. So this is still being populated, but it's a piece that we think is going to be really useful for communities. Be able to find out who the members are, and there's a mapping tool to tell you where the people are in the communities are. You can join as a member or as a community. Ideas and perspectives section for sharing stories, and then the tools. And the primary tool for this one is the Rural Disaster Resilience Planning Framework. As I mentioned before, it's a really simple piece. The planning framework itself has 4 steps, 16 activities. One of the pieces of feedback that we got from folks was that when they were working through this process, they had a tendency to really get lost in what they were doing, particularly when you're doing the community assessment pieces, where you're finding out what, 2 things, doing a hazard analysis and a resilience analysis of a community. People would be doing all these activities and have no idea where they were in the process. One of the nice things about the online world is that we can throw a nav bar on the side, and as you work through, no matter where you are in the process, you can see which step you're on and which activity that you're working through. We tried to keep it so that each activity was basically a page or a little bit more than a page worth of text, and then you would link out to the resources that you would need. So again, if you're setting up a community planning team, the resources that would be available for that were put together in a PDF. So this one has how to build a community team, how to get community buy-in, how to hold meetings, how to create a community vision, and there are resources for most of the steps in the process. Oops, where are we going? Again, the 16 activities. For each activity, there's some stuff for them to take a look at, the overview for it. If there are resources, you go over to the resource side. But the real meat of the program and the real heart of what the project was about were these 3 tools: the Rural Resilience Index, the Hazard Resilience Index, and the Hazard Risk Analysis. And I'm going to start with the hazard risk assessment. We sort of took 2 views to this. So this was, again, I keep mentioning the word neat. It was a neat project because the first thing it did was go out and look at what was in the literature and do the typical top-down academic thing of finding out what's best practice out there. Then it put that on the desk and it went out to 16 communities and said, what's resilience for you? How does it work? How do you plan for disaster? What is a disaster for you? Again, as I mentioned, for some communities, being landlocked and having no access for 3 months isn't a disaster. It's just fall. It's what they do. So what do these things mean to you? And then you put these 2 together, and when you take best practice across the world and you put it together with what comes out of the communities, you get some really unique ways of looking at the world. And they told us 2 things. One was that there is a need to take the hazard-based approach to disaster planning. And the hazard-based approach is the approach that says, what are all the hazards that are out there? What are the ones that could happen in your community now? How do you get ready for those? But then there was also coming out of the communities was the recognition that resilience is embedded in the community, is a part of how it's put together, the relationships between the people, the land, and the infrastructure, and how they work together. So the second part of resilience, one part of resilience is critical infrastructure and processes and tools and having enough supplies and all of those things. The second part of it is making sure that you've got a social fabric that is going to allow you to be able to deal with these types of things. So the tools that were developed for your community worked on both sides, the hazard risk assessment and the rural resilience side. The hazard risk assessment, for the quantitative people in the world, that have been grading at all this community-based stuff that I've been saying for the last little while, I apologize. I'm unashamedly from the qualitative side of the world, and most of the people in emergency planning aren't. They like numbers, so we didn't give them numbers, but we did give them something that looks like numbers. We came up with a model that had 84 hazards that were likely to be encountered in Canada, and we grouped those into 16 categories. And what a community does is go into one of the categories, and it sees what the potential hazards are that are within each category. When you've assessed your community on a category, you get the check mark. So let's go see if we can. Okay, so under atmospheric, we've taken a look at extreme cold, but let's go take a look at fog. So what a community would do is rather than working through all the 84 hazards, which will take you a fair bit of time, but believe it or not, there are some processes out there that want you to take on all 84 categories. What you do as a community is go through and isolate and pick a half dozen, pick 3. For that matter, if you've only got the resources to take on one, take one hazard and assess it, and let's take a look at it. The model is built around community engagement and community discussion. So the qualitative side coming back in. This isn't a ticky box number system for assessing things. What we do in the hazard risk side is ask, how likely is this to happen to you? And then on the resilience side, we ask, how resilient is your community to it? So the statements that are there are statements like fog is most likely to occur where it's occurred in the past. Does your community experience fog? Yes, no, need more information, or not applicable to us. So are you close to a large body of water? No, we're not. Fog can be caused when warmer air. Do temperature inversions occur in and around your community? No, they don't. Is your community in a valley? Sure. And then you take a look at it. Now, the idea is not that you add up the yeses and the nos and the preponderance wins. What the community has to do is take a look at these statements or rank the statements, then come back in a consensus process and ask, is this a high-risk hazard for our community, a low-risk hazard for our community, or do we need more information, or does this not apply to us? And the community will take a look at it. Hopefully they'll have a nice, robust discussion about it and decide that, well, it does happen every now and then, but we're going to call that one a low risk. And then they save it. Oops. And we'll go back into, let's take a look at heat waves. And we'll say that there's a whole bunch of yeses and one not applicable. And this one we'll say is a high risk. And you submit that. And the community would go through and rate itself on its hazards. And then at the end of this, what you can do is create a report out of that that makes, and it's a customized report. So you can either take a look at everything that's in there, all 84 hazards, or you can just go and pick the ones that are most, the ones that you thought were most applicable to you, or the ones that you did. And then you can, well, this is taking me in to look at everything. Okay. So the tool for selecting allows you to look at a bunch of different things. It allows you to pick which hazards you want to look at, whether or not you want to look at just the hazard risk indicator or the resilience indicator, and do you want to include all the little pieces or not, or just get a generalized one. And coming out the other end are strategies. So now what the community can do is print this off. They can either export it out into something like Excel or export it as a PDF, or they can just keep it online and print it from the online. And they have a list of how they rank the hazards for their community. And what you're particularly looking for are things that are the high risk. The second part of this tool is the resilience. So after you've done the hazard assessment, so you've done the hazard risk assessment, now what you can do is go in and do the resilience index. And the resilience index takes the same pieces, takes a look at them and says, how resilient is your community to this? So with the fog, most residents regularly check the weather and storm forecasting agencies. Is Environment Canada still even there anymore? There are installed fixed message signs, raised reflective pavement markers, lighted. So no, our community doesn't have any of that. There's a warning system in place to notify. No, we don't have that. Warning system, no, we don't have any of that. And so you take a look at the resilience factors for this hazard in your community, and then you rate yourself as having very low resilience. Once you've done your hazard assessment and you've done your resilience assessment, you can go back to that the tool that I was showing before, the report tool. And what a community wants to ideally look for is the pieces for which it has high risk but low resilience. So we talked to some folks in Manitoba, and the first time they went through it, they said that flood risk came out really high, and it's an annual it's an annual hazard for them. It's something that happens to them every year. But they said actually their resilience to it is pretty good. So if you're trying to do emergency planning, we're already good there. It's high risk, but we've also already got pretty good resilience to it. Some other communities could look at it and say, yeah, it's high risk, but our resilience isn't very good on it. So that's one of the ones that we're going to want to do something about. So the hazard side of the tools takes a look at the types of things that you could face in your community and how you would deal with those, how resilient you are to them, and identifies strategies that you can use to improve that.
Interject with a question. Our online audience hasn't been able to see all of this demo that you're doing. That's fine. I'm just wondering, can they create their own login, or is there a guest login that they can try? So if they go back to that original website, the drrplan.net.
When they first come to, so if I log out, when you first come in and you go to log in, it'll take you to a login screen, honest.
Okay, but they can create their own account.
When they go there, when the login screen it's a typical login screen where it says if you have an account, enter your information. If you don't, you can register.
Okay.
You do have to register, and we do filter them before giving an account back out to people.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
So that's on the hazard side. So there you go. So you can create an account right there. And the rural resilience structurally looks very similar. It's got a number of categories and then a number of criteria below it, but they're based around two constructs. One is around the community resources and the social structure, and the second is around disaster management capacity in your community. So on the disaster management side, how prepared is your community for disaster? Are your structures, are your farm and animals and livestock protected? And then on the community resource side, it looks at things like social structure. So are you close-knit and involved? Are you self-sufficient and resourceful? Are you stable and sustainable? And the model is the same thing. You go down and you mark off the criteria. You decide that you are high resilience. The other feature that's in the tools is that you can mark any one of these criteria as important to me. So again, when you're doing your report at the end, as you're working through all of these things, there are some that you either have lively argument about, or everybody says, you know what, without even doing this, that's something we need to work on. You can tag it so that it automatically comes up at the end. So functionally, the tool works the same. You go through, you rank your community on each of the factors, and then you create a report. And again, you can pick pieces of the report, or you can pick the whole report. And it generates a report for you. And again, you can scan down here and take a look on whether or not it was important. And I did everything, so I'm going to get absolutely everything there. The other thing, this one is a piece that we'd like to do some more work on in the future. The idea of strategies, because the other thing, so we've got communities to go in, identify the hazards that are high risk to them, identify the hazards that they've got low resilience to. You've identified those off. We found the 3 or 4 areas that we want to work on for our community. Now what? So from the literature and from talking to the folks and from the community research that we did, we put together a list of resilience strategies associated with each of the pieces. So our community is close-knit and involved. So one of the strategies could be to use collaborative whole community resource mapping to identify capacity needs, strengths, and deficits within and across different groups in the community. The strategy piece, it's that same problem. How do you complete a comprehensive, robust system that's easy to use? You've got you've got almost the mirror problem on the strategy side. How do you provide resources and strategies for communities that are each unique? So a lot of the strategies they tend to be 2 things. They tend to be mirrors of the risk factors. So if you have a risk of train crashes because you have a lot of uncontrolled intersections that go through farmland, the strategy is to put up more controlled train crossings. Some of them sound kind of almost a little bit silly, and others they're pretty generic and at a pretty high level. These aren't meant to be strategies that you would actually take and dump into your action plan. What they're intended to be is strategies or ideas that could spark the discussion in your community again about how can we take some of these strategies and how do we make them actually work for us? How do we make them useful for us, and what can we do with those? So building the resilience plan, and again, a lot of this stuff is it's basically right out of the disaster planning literature. So you're going to set a vision, you're going to develop some goals, you're going to identify the strategies, go take a look at what hazards you want to take on, go take a look at what characteristics in your community you want to work on, put an action plan together, and then that magic number 4, it's kind of like that get out of debt strategy. You're going to do all this planning, and then you'll get out of debt. You're going to do all this visioning and planning and come up with strategies, and you're going to implement it, and everything will be fine. This is the other place that the devil's in the details. The strength of this particular project is on its ability to bring communities together, to give them a process for engaging in disaster planning, and for building a very community-based, bottom-up look at what your community is and what challenges it faces and how you might deal with that. What we did find on the implementation of it was that a lot of communities were kind of lost once they had the plan. Now what do I do with it? I got a list of 17 strategies, but I get the same 3 people that helped us work through this whole thing. And I've still got the fact that if I want to put up more controlled railway crossings, who do I talk to? I don't have there is no mayor. The regional district hardly knows that we exist. The federal government, where are they? So you've got all those things that were challenges at the front end are challenges at the back end. One of the places that we're hoping to go with this project, we put in for funding this year. There was a second project that was working in Nanaimo and Parksville, I believe it was, that used a process called value-focused metrics. And these guys are hardcore numbers guys. If you ever want to have a really good argument on whether or not there's such a thing as expert systems, these guys will give you that argument. And so far, I think it's a draw, but they think they've won. Their project was kind of cool, too, because what they did was walk into community and a little bit perilous. They said, what are the things that are important to your community? What are the things that you value? What are your strengths? What are the things that are really important to you? Now, when you take a look at disaster planning, go pick 3 or 4 things in your community that you would want to work on, and let's put those up on a map. And then they use their an analysis of the community's values. You take those things, you put them up on the wall, you tear them apart into a number of tasks, and then you look at the resources it would take to perform those tasks, and then you use the community values to prioritize which ones would have the biggest impact on the community's values, which ones would have the highest financial cost or time cost. We've put our 2 projects, have been looking for a way to put to work together. We're really strong on the front end for helping communities find a way to figure out what it is they need to work on. They're awesome. Their tool is just awesome for figuring out, based on what your community states its values are, which of the possibilities are things that you could actually get some traction on and do. And one of the key ideas there of the value-based metrics or value-focused metrics is that if you've always got the challenge of there's these 17 things we need to do to make our community safer, if you can pick the 3 or 4 that are based on what your community really values, you're much more likely to get the buy-in and to get the people to want to invest time and money and effort into getting it going. So on the next step side, that's kind of where we're going on that. The last piece on the next steps for us, as I mentioned, the project as funded has been complete for about a year now. We got some implementation funding to get up and get running. We put in 2 proposals this year. One was to work together with the value-focused metrics folks. The other was one of the limitations to this project was that it didn't explicitly address Aboriginal issues and contexts and concerns. Many of the members in a couple of the communities that were involved in the project were predominantly Aboriginal, but it wasn't built around Aboriginal context and Aboriginal practice. And again, much of rural Canada consists of Aboriginal communities. So the 2 places that we're looking to go next, one is to look at how useful this tool and process would be for Aboriginal communities, and the second is to strengthen the implementation side of it. And with that, the websites are available. You can also find them just by Googling the Rural Disaster Resilience Project. Unfortunately, the URL for the tool is kind of ugly. We're working on that. We're actually going to be taking the project website and using that URL in the next little while. We would be very interested in anyone that, if you have any questions or if you'd like to find out more about the project, by all means, our contact information is there. Feel free to, the sites are designed to go in and for you to bump around and play with, so feel free. If you want more information on it, there's contact information there, and we'll get you plugged in with the emergency management folks at the JI and can go from there. And with that, any questions?
Thanks very much. Very, very interesting presentation. I was wondering, and you designed this specifically with rural communities in mind, but it strikes me that emergency response planning is sort of very high level a lot of the time, and then it depends a lot on individuals. And within the city itself and urban communities, there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus on that intermediate-sized community, like a neighborhood or other community structures. So how adaptable would this be to urban communities? One
of our co-PIs would be running over to give you a hug right now. Again, from the perspective of the people that fostered this project, they view community as not being necessarily a political structure. In fact, one of the communities that was a pilot community is actually only literally 15 kilometers away from a major urban center, but is still a very, the urban center hardly knows that it's there. The idea of being able to take and use this process within a neighborhood, within a larger community, is something that we've had a couple neighborhoods actually look at doing it. So it's built very much as a grassroots, bottom-up type of thing. So any community, however loosely you want to define it, would be able to use the process.
Just wondering whether you've had an uptake in interest or an increase in interest since Lac-Mégantic from towns that are on major railroads, trying to plan for, could that happen to us? How would we respond? How would we survive something like that?
I'd have to talk to the guys in EMD that are monitoring the site. I know that interestingly, we sought funding to move to an Aboriginal context, and I know a lot of rural Aboriginal communities have been joining into it, but I haven't heard so much from other communities.
Has been typing furiously away here, and I've been waiting for the question to come in. He says, really useful looking tool. Any testing outside of Canada? Is there a Spanish version? If not, is there anything in the works for other languages?
So I'll take those on in the order that they came. Yes, there's been interest in other countries. The state of Colorado and a couple communities in Colorado were both looking at it. And I think one of them is actually doing a comparison of the tool with a couple other tools that are more American-based. We've actually had a colleague in Australia who's using the process in his home community with the idea of being able to bring it out and get some interest there. So we've had interest from other communities, and while it is the language and the constructs fit fairly tightly to a Canadian perspective. And again, even the Aboriginal communities that are in it start telling us, like the political structures and whatnot that are embedded in it are that way. So I'm pretty sure that we'll get that feedback from the international community, that it's still a little place-based. No, we don't have it available in Spanish. It is available in French. There's a French side to it. It was fully translated. We don't at this point have funding or plans to go into Spanish, but we are really looking for ways to make this a sustainable and long-living site. So if there was interest from a group that wanted to work with us to expand it either into a different country or a different language, we'd be really interested in that. Which is a way of saying thanks for that question.
Go
ahead. Okay, I was wondering, would this help communities deal with the slowly unfolding disasters? And I'm thinking about the Fort Chip tribe, which is, I think, going through a long-term disaster because it's downwind from Fort McMurray. Have you thought about the applicability of this process to people like that?
The best way that I could answer that I can't say whether or not situations like that were explicitly thought of. But what I would say is that I would think that this process would uncover things like that and would give them a way of engaging with it. Actually, we had two pieces of feedback on the hazards we chose. One was that there's 84 of them. Are you guys nuts? But then the same person that said that says, could you put another category so we can add ours? So the intent of the process is to get a community to take a look at its own context. So either in terms of the time that it would, like a slowly unfolding hazard would be something that you could fit into there and make it work. If it's not already embedded in there, the process would help you take a look at it and uncover ways of dealing with it. It doesn't specifically tell you how to deal with any particular hazard. It sends you off to resources about those. But what its strength is in trying to get the community to explore its own strengths and challenges and to build communication around how are we going to address it and what can we do about it. So that's a really long-winded kinda.
My question was, I know you're a qualitative person. Can you quantify for us how this tool has been used and how it's being used?
I'll take a stab at it. We've had, I think, somewhere around 30 communities that we know of that have worked with it either through the project itself directly or that have contacted us and set up sites to do stuff with them. We're not actually monitoring on an ongoing basis. Right now, it's an unfunded project. So it was designed to be somewhat self-sufficient. One of the things that we found, and here's the ed tech guy in me coming out, everyone is always looking for technology to come up with a way to do things without people intervention. And it just doesn't work. And even in this project, what we found was that you either needed external folks nudging people along the process, or you needed a really strong champion. We had 2 or 3 communities where really strong champions emerged inside the community and took it forward. But the tool itself and the funder wanted a process that ran itself. So we're not currently, like, we are monitoring the site, but we're not keeping stats on who's actively involved and who's not. So it would be pretty anecdotal at this time. But I'd be comfortable saying that 30 communities have engaged with it.
Okay, I don't think we have any further questions, so thank you very much for your time, Ron.
Thank you for your interest on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate it.